So what today's presentation is going to include is some of the legislative context behind the program, how it came to be, so you know exactly what you're applying for and what the grant program is trying to accomplish. Eligibility, evaluation criterion, the public benefit, because as we mentioned, it's a state program, so there has to be a public benefit to it. The application preparation, that's the step-by-step walkthrough of the application section so that you're able to submit the best application for your project, for your cemetery that you're working on. And of course, the timeline about project selection and award announcement, what to anticipate there, and then the program requirements and obligations, if you were to be selected, what that would look like down the line. So the Historic Cemetery Grant Program was established in 2016 with House Bill 2637, specifically for the preserving outstanding examples of state's historical heritage, enabling historic cemeteries to continue to serve their communities, and honoring the military veterans buried within them. So of course, we understand the historic significance of a cemetery or a burial site, but the program also provides a little bit extra attention or incentive to especially military cemeteries. So if you have that, don't hesitate to share that within the application. Now, it is a competitive matching grant program for construction, renovation, or rehabilitation projects that preserve the historic character, features, and materials of a cemetery, or that maintain or improve the function of a cemetery. And we'll go through the difference between, say, a capital improvement project and some more programmatic or interpretive types of improvement or projects that you can do within this grant program. And then, of course, the House bill also established a Historic Cemetery Advisory Committee, which basically means a group of professionals and experts within the state of Washington that know about cemeteries and the needs and the programming around it in order to help select the best projects that are also within the goals of HB 2637. So what is an eligible property? So if you're familiar with some of the other grant programs that DAHP or the Historic Preservation, Washington Trust for Historic Preservation administers, you might be familiar with the state register or sometimes even the national register, or if you're within a local district of your own historic district within your own local municipality. But for this one, none of that designation is required, although if you do know that your property or the property that you work on is a historically designated property at any level, it's always great to mention because we want to prioritize or look more into them. But eligible properties only need to be defined as a cemetery with 5 or more burials and established over 50 years ago. That's the easiest benchmark. And applicants can include private owners, so private property where there's a family burial or you so happen to be a community burial over the years and decades can apply. Nonprofit organizations, you often hear names like Friends of King County Cemetery or something like that, more than welcome to apply. And of course, local governments. Some of the emails from previous application cycles that I've received taking over the grant management are from Parks Department or Public Works Department that so happen to manage a public local municipal cemetery. So anyone involved in a cemetery can apply on behalf of that cemetery. Depending on the ownership or the local government, there's some follow-up paperwork and authorization you might need, but they're all eligible. And basically that's it. And you might think, well, that's easy. I have more than 5 burials and I'm established over 50 years and I'm one of the 3 types of people, but it is competitive. This year we have been allocated $300,000 of grant dollars specifically for cemeteries with a limit of $50,000 per project. So bare minimum is about 6 projects. However, if we get a bunch of say $25,000 projects instead of $50,000 projects, then we could have up to 12 cemeteries this biennium cycle. But those are just some numbers to think about. But 5 or more, you know, you guys are obviously here for a reason. You guys know what your cemeteries look like. So don't be discouraged by any of the eligibility aspects. Now the project part, then we start to build a little bit more towards your project, right? It should be for construction, renovation, or rehabilitation projects that preserve the historic character, features, and materials of the cemetery, or that maintain or improve the functions of the cemetery. Now, I think I copied the Secretary of Interior standards for this one from the barn presentation I gave yesterday, but you can actually ignore that part because with most cemeteries, you're looking at landscapes and you're looking at individual smaller monuments and headstones. So this doesn't quite apply. We always encourage you to look into the Secretary of Interior standards if you're working on a brick and mortar property, but it's not necessarily a requirement of this program. So excuse me for not taking that out of my previous presentation. Now, all of the project phases or scopes of work that you want to include within your project that you're developing and you're pitching to the Cemetery Advisory Committee for funding of a grant should go within one of these really 3 work types. And then I put other there because sometimes people get creative and they still are within the bounds of a program. But the big 3 that we see most common is going to be protection and security. So that includes gates, fences, lighting. I think cameras are also eligible. Any kind of security feature that helps maintain the property would be a good work type. Restoration and preservation. So that's the most classic and traditional preservation approach to this. You're looking at cleaning and restoring headstones, mausoleums if they need to be repointed or cleaned up, or sometimes even rebuilt if they've been collapsed or destroyed. Monuments, landscape features, like if you know your property used to have a small memorial pond in it, but it's been, you know, washed out throughout the years or eroded, bringing back those historic landscapes with some kind of historic documentation that it was there are certainly eligible projects that I believe the committee would support. And of course, interpretive displays like signage, plaques, and markers. In the example here, this is just a small kiosk that I think one of the counties got in 2 biennium cycles ago. So any kind of interpretive displays that makes it a little bit more approachable to the public or to maintain information, those can also be supported. And then other, I'm not really sure what goes in here, but because cemeteries are pretty atypical to what we see in the historic preservation field of, you know, restoring brick and mortar houses, there's opportunities here, but at the end of the day, we're gonna want to prioritize projects that have some kind of physical, tangible, and public access result, right? So a question that comes up a lot is, are we allowed to get grant awards for general research or surveys or GPR or ground penetrating radar studies? And while they're not necessarily prohibited, one, we would want it to result in something physical, like if consultation leads to a plaque being developed, we can certainly look into supporting or reimbursing that through a grant award. But priority goes to the classic physical improvement type of stuff. And feel free to drop in the chat if you have specific questions about what you're already thinking about for your project. And like I said, always feel free to revisit us if you have any questions like, hey, I'm looking to do this or that. Do you think that would be supported by the committee? And sometimes it takes that individual consultation, but the takeaway from this slide is physical, tangible, and public projects that help improve or continue to preserve your cemetery and its grounds. Those are prioritized over the more programmatic things that might lead to an interpretive display, but the interpretive display or the gate or the mausoleum, the physical aspect is going to be prioritized during that competitive selection process. Now that you know if your cemetery and its property grounds are eligible and the types of projects that are prioritized for this grant award, then we're going to talk about the eligible expenses. Now, the biggest thing to keep in mind is, if this is your first introduction to this program, is that it is a reimbursement type of program, but it also requires no match. So what that means is that you would have to find a way to pay for all of the project costs upfront. And if your project is selected, we would reimburse up to 100% of that project, right? So let's say, you have a rotating fund to do mausoleum restoration for, 10 mausoleums on your property, and it costs $10,000 to do so, cleaning it up and cleaning up some of the stonework, and you're able to pay all that upfront. The program is designed to reward that kind of historic preservation investment back into your property, because we know that it's important to your community and to your family and to the people and their families within the burial grounds. We would reimburse that $10,000. So those are the two big things, is that you have to show that you're ready to pay for the project and begin the project up front, and we can reimburse as a grant reward up to 100% of all of the cash expenditures that fall back within the eligible projects, right? So let's break that down a little bit more. Grants may be used to reimburse cash expenditures related directly to approved capital improvement projects, such as consultation research must result in that physical and material work. So let's say you need to develop new signage for the area. We can reimburse the mock-up and the consultation and the physical manufacturing and installation of the sign, but it should result in a sign. It can't just be, hey, we spent $3,000 on a total property survey to count every headstone and to catalog every headstone, but it didn't result in a physical improvement. That's going to be a harder case to make for the committee to select your project. Cash expenditures have to be made after July 1st, or really after the grant contract has been signed. And based on our timeline, that's going to look around to be January 2022, because the application closes in mid-October, October 17th. We're going to have a selection committee meeting around early December, and then we're going to be able to announce it by the end of the year, and that means that you can begin to start it at the beginning of next year. So just keep that timeline. You don't want to get too ahead of yourself where you really feel like you're going to get this grant award, so you went ahead and did the work. Make sure all of the scopes of work and the exact procedures are outlined within the contract that you'll be getting if your project is selected. So just keep that in mind. And the July 1st date is to really punctuate the biennium cycle, which begins on July 1st. But really, you don't want to start anything until after the contract has been signed. That's the cleanest way to make sure that your reimbursement goes through smoothly. And finally, all labor funded by the grant must be performed by a qualified contractor with an estimate submitted with your project budget. So before we get to developing that project budget, this is something that you want to keep in mind, is that within your application, you're going to want to have at least one and maybe even 2 or 3 bids if you want to show that you really did your homework on the work that's needed to be done. I know with a lot of friends of cemetery societies and organizations, there's a lot of donated labor or volunteer labor. Because this is a capital improvement grant program, that means that it has to go through cash expenditures, which often means through a qualified professional contractor that you hire, rather than, hey, we have a group of 20 nonprofit members, they're going to go out and clean the cemetery. Can we get $2,000 back for that? And unfortunately, in this case, no. But if you have a professional headstone cleaner or restorer, and you bill them $5,000 to clean however many headstones, that's exactly the kinds of projects that this grant program can support and fund. So, you know, make sure to distinguish that within your project. And I'll touch on this once we get into the weeds of the application as well. But just because the volunteer labor isn't going to be reimbursed as part of a grant award, we really like to see, or the committee really likes to see, community involvement and showing that, you know, there's people that care about the cemetery. So always include that in your budget and in your project to show that, like, hey, we have people ready to clean the grounds before the fence is installed, or before the headstones are cleaned up, or before the mausoleum is restored, to show that there is community onus and community investment in it. So don't hide the fact that you have volunteer labor, but just know that it can't be part of the cash expenditure reimbursement. And as I mentioned earlier, this year we have a pool of $300,000 up to $50,000 per project. This doesn't necessarily mean that it's a flat $50,000 for every applicant. You really want to show us what you're doing. So, you know, if it's just a $10,000 project to simply clean some headstones, that's perfectly fine. Don't try to make some giant comprehensive project just to meet that $50,000 mark. If you do reach there, that's perfectly fine. That's what the program allows, but don't feel like it's necessary to meet that $50,000, because if you have a small project, sometimes it's likelier to be selected because we know it's a one and done. It's not some large project that might not be able to complete in time or within the parameters. So just keep those points in mind. So because this is funded by state dollars, there has to be some kind of public component to it, right? So this just means that public access to the cemetery must be provided under reasonable terms and circumstances. Oftentimes, if this is local government grounds or nonprofit grounds, that's certainly fine. You know, nothing too new there. But if it's on private property or family property, we just want to make sure that there is some way to access that for the public, whether it's bare minimum being able to walk by it, or if you have specific visitation days where it's open to the public, just some kind of public engagement. And you can explain yourself in however way you want, but that is a component that they're looking for as part of the selection committee. And then, of course, all grant recipients, if you're chosen, must actively maintain the historic cemetery for a minimum of 10 years. So that's just going through a maintenance agreement that you have to sign, and we contact you year after year to make sure that, you know, it's just maintained so that it doesn't go back to an abandoned state or neglected, or you know, you suddenly sell off the property and it's going to be removed and something's going to be built over it, right? There's still some kind of maintenance and preservation ethic that we want to support through this program. So just something to keep in mind. Okay, now that you guys have been introduced to the context of the Historic Cemetery Capital Grant Improvement Program, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the application, because sometimes there are specific questions and terms and ways to present your project and your cemetery that it's the clearest and most accurate and most approachable project for the selection committee to choose.
Hey, Huy, I'm going to jump in real quick before we move on to this part, just because there's been a number of questions in the chat that have come up, and people have been following those pretty well, but I want to make sure everyone is familiar with those, with the chat and looking through that. One that is come up is around prevailing wage and what is a qualified contractor. I think a qualified contractor needs to demonstrate that they have done, that they have had experience doing the work that you're asking of them. They really should be a licensed contractor when you're using a contractor as well. If a cemetery is owned by a municipality, by a city or county, yeah, prevailing wage is going to apply, just as city and counties are subject to to some of those, to prevailing wage requirements, like any city or county would do with any kind of capital project. So if a city or county is an applicant, local government is an applicant, then yes, that comes into play. There was a question around whether it's possible for multiple cemetery groups to kind of pool their pool a request for funding across multiple cemeteries. And no, we can't do that. We do need a specific application or one application for each specific cemetery. So we can't kind of pool resources from that standpoint. The last other question on there is around surveys, and I think we talked about that a little bit. Ultimately, it's a capital grant, so the priority is going to go to things like repairing headstones, cleaning headstones if needed, those security measures. We will certainly follow up if people are interested in including a survey as part of their grant request. We can get clarity from the state, but as I say, the priority is going to go to actual capital projects. I think if you're doing a survey as part of the work, it's really great to include that in the application and say, hey, we're going to conduct this survey. And with the information gleaned from that survey, what we'd like to do is in turn, create the signage or create the interpretive piece or the kind of physical element that would be considered capital. Keep asking those questions. It's great to see in the chat. I'll keep answering as quickly as I can, and I'm going to let Huy keep going in terms of kind of step-by-step going through some of the application pieces. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Chris. I see we have a prevailing wage question and a list of qualified contractor question. I'll let Chris help me out with those, but we'll continue here. So, like I said, now that we understand the context of the grant program, we're going to dig deeper into the application preparation so that you or your organization submit the best application that you can, because oftentimes we understand that there's going to be 50 or 20 or 30 cemeteries that are in need of financial and preservation support at any given time, and sometimes you have a really good project, but you don't articulate it or prepare well enough, and then it gets scored lower than someone else. So we're really here to help you show the best and most accurate application for your project. So with that, I'm going to actually bounce to the real application webpage. So you'll see links all over our social media as well as DAHP's web pages, but just starting from scratch at our webpage, preservewa.org, you can click on programs, you can click on grants, then you click on historic cemetery grant. And this is the landing page. You're gonna probably end up here a lot just as you develop your application materials. Just reiterating some context. There's a guidelines and procedure packet, which really to me today is just saying this part out loud and for you to engage with us. But if you need to rehash anything in text form, this is a great packet. I encourage you to at least download it. If you don't like to print things out, at least download it and have it within your back pocket of your computer. It has everything that I explained today, and it also has all the fields of the application, so you know what to look out for as you gather all your materials and files. We recommend that you have your own separate Word document as you fill in some of the information, and then a folder of all your photos, bids, screenshots, and other kinds of documents in one folder, so that when you're ready to sit in front of the actual application, you could just copy and paste all your answers and upload all the materials all at once, rather than piecemealing it together and building your application that way. So let's go through it right now. So in sections 1, 2, and 3, those are pretty clear. Property information, owner information, and if you're not the owner, applicant information for you to say who you are as represented or authorized to be kind of the project manager if your award gets selected. So if your cemetery doesn't have a clear address, a local description like directions or geographic coordinates are always helpful. It's just for us to do some additional research when we get your application. We're like, oh yeah, that's exactly here. Owner information. If the cemetery is abandoned, skip to the applicant information. So it's okay if you don't know who the owner is, or it's completely abandoned, or like I said, it's part of public grounds and you're working with the city to get a local permit or local authorization for that. All of that is acceptable. If we're kind of unsure about your authorization or your direct connection to the cemetery, we'll reach back out to you, but abandoned cemeteries are okay. So if you're just the applicant, you can see here, the cemetery is abandoned and I will provide the care and maintenance certificate from DAHP. So you're going to want to contact Guy Tassa for that, who is the state physical anthropologist, and his name will come up a lot too, and I'll share that in a sec. But if you're working on an abandoned cemetery, get a care and maintenance certificate. So that's just something to note. Okay, getting to the more dense parts. Section 4 is going to be cemetery description. This is going to be the who and why this cemetery needs attention, needs grant support, right? So some of the stuff is going to be physical and numerical, but some of the stuff can be historical and descriptive. So just keep that in mind as you're trying to build a narrative on who this cemetery is representing, the heritage embodied within it, and who is maintaining it or looking after it, if anyone. So you're looking for a year established, earliest burial date, latest burial date, if it's still active, or if it's been out of commission or full after a certain year, how big it is on its acreage, number of burials. And an important one here, as I mentioned, with the program goal or the program attention, is to military burials. And if you have 0%, that's completely fine. It's just a bonus incentive. You might get a bonus point or two or more attention for the selection committee, because focusing on or prioritizing military burial grounds is written within the House bill legislation language. So that's just something that we want to capture. Then you're going to want to explain with your own words or your own research, maybe you've already done this, or maybe you need to, the historical and cultural significance of the cemetery grounds. And I won't read this whole thing, but you can explain why it's important to the community or the families or the individuals that are buried within the grounds or the people who visit the grounds. This is really an opportunity for you to show why your cemetery that you're working on or that you're advocating for needs this specific grant support, financial support, attention from the state, whether it's historic or architectural, or sometimes you could just say, well, we have the largest cemetery in the state or something like that. And Chris, if you could help me out here. Oh, I think you already did very fast on it. You can see in the chat that there are some external resources from the National Park Service. They're called bulletins, and I believe number 44 and number 48 really speak to evaluating and caring for historic cemeteries and burial grounds. So make sure to look in the chat. It's also in the guidelines and procedures packet, a direct link to it. And if you forget or can't find it, feel free to reach out to us. But the National Park Service does have specific resources to help point you in the right direction on how to best explain the historical and cultural significance of your cemetery. Back to the physical site conditions and changes over time. This is just explaining, like, if you've gotten more burials over time, or a highway was built through it in the 80s or something like that, or if the ownership changed, or if the Friends of Blank took over care of it in 2010 or something like that. It's just for us and for the committee to understand the context of it. Is it a cemetery that has been long-term maintained, but it really needs support now more than ever? Or is this cemetery been abandoned for 20 years and it's a public good to reinvest and give new attention to it? Just give us some context about it, be honest and accurate here, and it will best provide a clear picture of who the project is supporting and what the project is for the committee to select. And then here is historic designation status of the property. You can contact Michael Hauser, who's a state architectural historian, but also Guy Tassa, who I believe with Michael helped maintain a list of registered cemeteries. They're not necessarily part of the State Heritage Register or the National Register of Historic Places, but it just helps us and helps the committee reconnect some of those historic resources and research that might have already been done about the property, so that you're not starting from scratch. If you need any help with that, certainly reach out to the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, and they'll help point you in the right direction. If, say, you just picked up the cemetery and you know nothing about it, or maybe you can provide some information if it's been in your family for decades, right? And then just some other information like previous grant requests. This program has been here for 3 biennium cycles. It's not prohibited to ask again for additional money, or if you asked before but you just weren't selected and now you have an improved application or something like that. It's just to give us context of who's making the request. Other restrictions, like, is there already an easement on the property? Like, you're already in contract with the city or your town to not demolish or remove, or is the cemetery protected in some kind of way through an easement or a covenant or a contract or anything like that? Okay, moving on to section 5, project proposal and budget. This is where you take the information described here about the condition and the needs and the size and the importance of your property, and you explain how it actualizes into a specific project. So what you're going to want to do, like I mentioned, is to categorize your project within at least one of the 4 work types: protection and security, restoration and preservation, interpretive displays, and the uncommon chance other, if you don't think it fits in one of the 3. And it's important at this part of the application to go in chronological order, because as you see here, there's not much to fill out in this section. But if you click on it, more fields pop out so that you can populate it with specific answers. So let's say that we're going to install a fence and we're going to install a sign. So those 2 pop up. And with each type of work, you're going to want to give a verbal description, including treatments, techniques, and materials used. So here we'll say, install new wrought iron fence around entire perimeter. And of course, I'm just doing this just as a walkthrough, but here you're going to want to be as thorough as you can. If you have contractors lined up, if you have designs lined up, if you have drawings lined up, you can include it all in this section to show us that you've really prepared and you've done your homework and you're ready to begin the project, rather than, hey, I'm thinking about doing a fence, but I have no idea where to start, right? Like, those projects are harder to put at the top of the list than someone who's ready to go and they just need that financial incentive or financial support through that grant award. Protection and security timeline. So I chose protection and security. So the timeline is just like 2 weeks in August or whatever, just so that we know when to get your contract on a specific timeline. And then of course the cost. This is the total cost of all of the protection and security items in one. So let's say, $9,000. And here you're going to want to support this entry within the application with at least one bid or contract or quote, right? Obviously, don't sign or commit or pay for anything yet. Right here, we just want to see that you're using numbers that are from a real world quote or bid, rather than just making something up like I'm cleaning one headstone and it's going to cost $50,000, right? So at least have one bid or quote or contract draft within your application. And then here, you also want to leave room for a contingency plan, because we're obviously, you know, maybe you guys don't know, but us within the historic preservation field, we're very familiar with cost of wood going up, a lot of labor shortages, sometimes the timeline, like I don't know necessarily the season for cemetery restoration, but sometimes headstone restoration groups are only available through like the fall, and it gets too cold or it gets too hot any other time of the year, and you have to really prioritize in this time, or you have to get on a wait list, or if you want to be bumped into a wait list, you have to pay extra money or something like that, right? So within the cost section of your project, you're going to want to add 10 or 15% of contingency dollars to it. So let's say we know the fence based on one bid is $8,000, but to be safe, we're going to request $9,000 just in case prices go up or we have to pay additional hidden costs or added costs later here or there, right? So the budget and the request here doesn't have to be 100% flat and static to your exact bid, but it needs to be within a reasonable ballpark of how much a project should cost. So keep that in mind. And here it's going to ask, are the funds fully committed yet? And if you say yes, that means that you have the money on hand, you know, either your own private money from your family, or you have a rotating operating budget within your nonprofit or your local government for parks and recreation or whatever. And you can, and it's not the worst to click no, but if you click no, it will ask you, well, what is your plan to get those funds ready if you were to be selected? So a lot of times those answers are going to be, I'm going to get a loan, or I have additional support from this grant, or I anticipate on, this other financial resource or something like that. So selecting no for are the funds fully committed yet is not the end of the world, and it definitely cancels out your application. But you just want to be honest with us so that we can get a better picture of it, of your total request. And then it calculates for you the total project based on the numbers that you put in and based on how many of these that you select. And the total project cost and the total grant request, I put it in the form to be the exact same number. But here is where you can also put your contingency. So let's say it costs $9,000, but you are going to request $10,000 just to be safe. You can certainly put that in there. None of this is static or hard pressed, but you want to be honest and clear with your answer so that we can best match you during the selection process. And then here is a very important part, and this is where Guy Casa, state physical anthropologist, hops back in, is will the project require ground disturbance or excavation? Obviously, if we're working with cemeteries, there might be some ground disturbance, whether you need to relocate a headstone back to where you believe it used to be and it got moved by erosion, or you're building a new kiosk and you need to dig 3 feet into the ground. Ground disturbance also is not the prohibited or the worst thing in the world to happen to your project, but if you anticipate it, you should contact Guy Casa to see if, based on your location and your scope of work, if a archaeology permit is required, which also might include hiring an archaeologist to monitor the site and complete the permit. And you should include that cost within your budget. So this section is really important right here, ground disturbance. Don't hesitate to call or email and say, hey, I'm filling out this grant application. I think we're going to build a new mausoleum here. Do you think I need a archaeologist on site or an archaeology permit? And he can respond to you there. And let's say that the answer is yes, right? And he's going to tell you an archaeologist monitoring for 2 weeks is going to cost, you know, $1,000 or something. You can include that in your project budget as long as, you know, you can tie that back into a physical capital improvement part of your project. And we can reimburse you for that as a grant reward, but this part really needs to be fleshed out before you submit your application. And then rounding back out, public benefit, just as I mentioned earlier, is there public access? Is it already public grounds that anyone can visit during park hours? Or, you know, is there any kind of visitation or public programming or educational things that, like maybe you even host a ceremony for the veteran or for the military burials that you have every year, right? Like that's certainly something to mention within this question. Future plans, that's just, you know, most of the answers are going to be yes, we will continue to maintain the cemetery for at least 10 years or forever, or, you know, however long your family owns it. Or if you already know ahead of stuff, like in 5 years, we're going to be able to, you know, purchase a fence, or in 2 years, we're also going to add a new groundskeeper structure to the property. You know, be honest here, and it will help us develop that full picture of your project. Preservation easement, simple yes or no. The answer should be yes. If the answer is no, I will call or email you and ask why. But that's basically one of the requirements of the program, is that, you know, you will enter into a preservation easement to show that you're not going to demolish or you know, do anything that is against the preservation standards for the next 10 years. And of course, additional information, if there's anything about your property or your project that you weren't able to fill in any of these questions above, you know, that gives us context on why your project or your cemetery or your organization should be selected for the award, just put it in there. And then finally, attachments. So let me go back to the slide. So the attachment checklist is all the extra photos, screenshots, bids, and quotes that weren't able to be included in the actual application that you're going to collect within a digital folder in your computer, and you're going to upload it all at the same time. So I'm going to walk through that real quick because I know we're rounding out for final questions and answers, but any contractor bids and cost estimates or conditions assessment used to develop your proposal. If it's in digital form already, that's great, just attach it. If you got it in paper, scan it and attach it. Images or product pages for proposed materials for the project, like if you're buying special cleaning chemicals or equipment, or you know, you need to buy a wheelbarrow of limestone to remake a mausoleum or anything like that, and you already know the provider or the manufacturer you're using, you know, give us any kind of information that shows us that you did the homework and that you're ready to go with the project as soon as you find out that you get selected, rather than, you know, having a bunch of missing information and not being sure. We can certainly help you out at any point, but once you get to the selection committee phase, it's really important to have as much information as you can to show that you're ready to be selected, right? Public view, so that just means, you know, standing at the road or the front gate, or if it's in public grounds, just to give us a context of where the cemetery is. More context information, up to 8 images illustrating the overall condition and landscape of the cemetery. So this is like zooming out and showing how big the cemetery is. And maybe it's small, and if it's small, just take a picture from each corner of the property, getting up closer to the specific work, 15 images clearly illustrating the condition of the area of the proposed work. Like if you have crumbling, dirty headstones, take close-up pictures of that, take close-up pictures of where, you know, teens are jumping over a fence and vandalizing, or take a picture of where there's erosion and water and flooding happens every year to a specific plot of land within your cemetery. You know, any number of images certainly helps us pitch to the committee, who will look over all the materials and fully understand what your cemetery needs, how your project can address it, and if you're ready to go start the work, right? You know, the numbers 1, 8, and 15, they're just there just to have some static numbers and some goals to reach, but the more the better, as long as they're clear and organized, and I'll show you how to do that in a sec. Contractors and consultants. So if you are using you know, special cemetery restoration people or carpenters or masonry workers, you know, we just want to know if they're qualified. Sometimes it's a simple their website or their bio or their resume, or if they're, you know, if they don't have that kind of professional stuff, it's not quite the end of the world. Just create a bullet list of, you know, we've worked with them for 5 years and they've restored, you know, 3 headstones every year that we can afford them. You know, anything that describes it is perfectly fine. Local governments, just make sure you have a department mission, lead staff, and annual budget so that we know, you know, who the grant is helping out, if it's a Parks and Rec department or something like that. Nonprofits, a list of board and their affiliations and annual operating budget. Just make sure there's a clear line of and no conflict of interest. And of course, once you have all that, what would do me as the grant administrator and the committee a real great deal of service is if you have a text document that clearly lists all of the items. So that's going to be, you know, Huy Cemetery photo 1, Huy Cemetery photo from the street, Huy Cemetery photo from photo of a headstone, right? Huy Cemetery headstone restoration quote, Huy Cemetery mausoleum restoration quote, right? If you put that into a text document list, that would certainly help us as we receive all the applications, clearly file it, get the committee the documents they need. They can fully understand the project and get you your answer and potentially your reimbursement if once we get to the end of the program. That's going to help everyone out, right? So just keep that in mind as you gather the materials for your project. Okay, so that was a lot to work through. I'm back here at the standby screen. I'll just flip through here in case we miss anything, but oh yeah, and then this was the contact information. So actually, I'll actually stay on this for a little bit if anyone's writing notes. But like I said, their contact information is available both on the application, the guides and procedures on their website, on our website, but definitely check in with them, especially Guy Tassa, if you have any questions about the ground disturbance or the cemetery register. Or what's it called, Chris? It's just is it a register or is it just a list?
No, there's not an official register for cemeteries. Some cemeteries are listed on the Washington Heritage Register. There may even be some on the National Register as well. We do not have a separate cemetery-specific register. There is a database, though, however, that Guy Tassa does maintain. Yeah. So he maintains just a database of cemeteries across the state, of which there's surprisingly a lot. I want to say it's close to 3,000 when you include really small cemeteries and those that are abandoned as well, that we actually know about. Anyway, I will put Guy's, you have it up here, but I will put Guy's contact info in the chat as well. So you guys can pull it right from there, and that has his office number and his email as well. So that should be easy to find. I did want to provide one clarification on the easements piece, and I put that in the chat also. The easements, if you are a local government, a city or county that owns the cemetery, easements are not required for cemeteries owned by local government. So,
Right.
so there's no easement component there. It is only for nonprofits or private cemetery owners. But if it's a city or county, you're not required to enter into that easement.
Right, because that would be just an easement enforced by yourself, right? It's already
Right,
public grounds, yeah.
In some ways, yep. So that's a distinction there. And then I know there's a lot of questions just kind of around the resources that came out, and so around resources for restoring your cemetery or headstones, so on and so forth. We mentioned a couple of those, the preservation briefs. In the chat, I did include a link to that preservation brief number 48, which is specific around repairing grave markers. DAHP also has an entire website devoted to cemetery preservation guidance, and they have several references on how to preserve cemeteries on that website. So that link is in there. And then finally, DAHP also maintains a website about researching your historic cemetery. And so I put that in the chat as well. So be sure to sift through there and pull out those links to those specific resources as you deem necessary. They're great as you're looking, as well, especially if you're talking about preservation projects on existing headstones or other kind of markers that are found in the cemetery. A lot of that is really, really good stuff.
Yeah, and that's perfectly fine for an email or dropping in on office hours. We'd love to look into it more for you. But all right, I think that's everyone. All right, thank you guys. Have a good night.
Thanks all, much appreciated. Thanks for coming.